We've spoken in this series of lectures about unintentional killings that might be involuntary manslaughter under gross negligence, or might be the mens rea of malice for murder too under a theory of depraved heart. As a wrap-up to this segment of criminal homicide, I want to raise one more example. It occurs all over the country despite police warnings. I want you to think about this. Should it be involuntary manslaughter or murder too? It's called celebratory gunfire. At midnight to usher in the new year, people fire guns up in the air all over the country. It's dangerous and it's illegal. There are numerous reports of injuries from this practice. Let's suppose we could track a particular bullet in a particular gun to someone who died. Which criminal homicide would this be? Would it be involuntary manslaughter because it's gross negligence? Or would it be more egregious and would be murder too under a theory of depraved heart? We tend not to treat this as depraved heart murder. We tend to treat this as involuntary manslaughter. Let's examine the elements of depraved heart murder to see why. The first element prosecution needs to prove, after showing there was a homicide, is that average people know this practice endangers human life in general. The prosecution is going to argue that everyone knows this much about science. What goes up has got to come down, and that bullets going up are like missiles traveling back to Earth, and they're going to endanger people who might be out watching this. Defendant's going to push back on this. Defendant's going to say, is it really true that under the objective test, average people do know this basic scientific rule? Defendant's going to say, possibly not. That's why there are so many public service announcements every year in December warning people not to engage in this behavior. If it were so obvious, defendant argues, why do we need to keep warning people about the dangers of this kind of gunfire? That's element number one. Second is the requirement that the behavior has to be base antisocial or done with a base antisocial motive. That's the big difference between involuntary manslaughter and murder too. We're looking for behavior that isn't just done badly, executed recklessly. We're looking at behavior that's done with such callous disregard, either by how it was done or because of its motive. Prosecution's going to argue that firing guns up in the air serves no socially redeeming purpose, that the firing of guns is so dangerous, and specifically firing them up in the air, this conduct needs to be banned. But defense is going to have a counter-argument here as well. Defense is going to say that how can this be labeled base antisocial behavior or with a base antisocial motive if communities all over the country engage in it as a means of celebration? Doesn't that mean that the behavior by definition isn't base antisocial if everybody's doing it? And it raises an important question. Should a community be allowed to dictate what constitutes base antisocial behavior? Or should we be imposing a more universal or normative standard on this element? For our purposes in this class, I don't care how you choose to resolve the issue, as long as you recognize both sides of this particular topic with respect to base antisocial motive or behavior. Third element, does defendant subjectively appreciate that this conduct endangers human life in general? That's the subjective test. We're going to focus on defendant himself when he fires in the air. This may also be difficult to prove. Prosecution's going to argue defendant knew this basic science fact, that what goes up's got to come down. That this scientific principle is so basic, of course he knew it. Now I want to pause here and repeat. It's a subjective test, so we need to show that defendant knew this risk, not that defendant should have known the risk. Our analysis for element number 3 has to be the defendant knew this level of risk. Analysis that incorporates that defendant should have known of the risk is an objective test. The words should have known are really shorthand code for saying average people knew it, you should have known it too. That's element number 1. For element number 3, we want to ask instead, did defendant know of this risk? And so this case is probably going to be involuntary manslaughter, if we can prove which bullet came from which gun fired by which person. Why is it involuntary manslaughter? Let's use this example as a review of involuntary manslaughter. Involuntary manslaughter, as you'll recall, is an unintentional homicide committed without malice and with gross negligence. For this crime, prosecution's got to prove the defendant knew or should have known about a substantial and unjustifiable risk of death or serious bodily harm. Without the requirement of a subjective awareness or base antisocial behavior, it's much easier to prove involuntary manslaughter. The argument would be the defendant should have appreciated the substantial risk. Depending upon the crowds watching all of this, there is a low to medium risk that a bullet's going to come down and actually hit somebody. But the magnitude of the harm, if that event were to happen, is devastating. That's going to result in death or serious bodily injury. So that's the substantial risk part. And of course, there's no justifiable reason for engaging in such risky behavior. Celebrating's great, not that way. You want to celebrate? Pop champagne. Don't fire a gun.